Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Able Voices podcast. I'm Dr. Rhoda Bernard, founding managing director of the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education and the assistant chair of the music education department at Berklee College of Music. And I am proud to present this podcast featuring disabled artists and arts educators. We are inviting artists with disabilities to be guest hosts for the Able Voices podcast. Today, you'll meet our next guest host, Jeremy Andrew Davis. Jeremy Andrew Davis is a multi-hyphenate writer, film director, disability advocate, and representation consultant, entrepreneur, and social media content creator. He is on a mission to transform disability representation, shaping the cultures of tomorrow through the stories of today. Jeremy draws on his neurodivergent, multi-disabled, non-binary identity to broaden society's cultural horizons through epic stories that immerse audiences into experiences of marginalized people who must odyssey through a hostile world to demonstrate their power. Welcome, Jeremy. We are delighted to have you as our next guest host of the Able Voices podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
We are so excited for this conversation. So I'd like to start off by asking you to tell us your story as an artist and a creative. How did you get started and how did you get to where you are today?
Well, story has always been a major part of my life. Stories in all formats, from novels, TV, movies, even songs, the stories that we tell through music have always been a major part of my life and a major coping mechanism too. So, growing up, I would escape into stories or I would explore through stories. And I, in middle school, around that time was where I really started to become consciously aware of how much stories was having an impact on my life. And I wanted to do that with my life. I wanted to tell my own stories and express myself, but also tell stories that made the kind of impact in other people's lives that other stories had made in mine. And as I was preparing for this podcast, I actually had an epiphany thinking about this question where, so I come from a very musical background. Both my parents are musicians. My mom was a music teacher. And also involved in other areas of arts. And I realized that story was the one outlet where there wasn't any demands or expectations placed on me. There wasn't like practice that I had to do growing up. So there wasn't this pressure. And I would write for fun and for self-expression. And I think that also sucked me in because it's like, oh, I don't have this critic. Of course, now later in life, that critic is in the background running all the time. But yeah, the story elements of me being able to express myself unfiltered has been a major component to that. And as I've gotten to this stage in my writing and my storytelling, I've been bringing that back in, and you go through years of learning how to properly tell a story, and so that critic is always running. And these days I'm pushing that critic down more and just doing, okay, what do I want to express, while also applying the lessons that I've learned.
Wow. You said a lot of things I want to know more about. So you said that you had this shift in your perspective in middle school.
Mm-hmm.
Was there something that made that happen? How did this realization come about to you?
That I don't know. And I've thought about, I think it was a growing realization. It wasn't like an instant epiphany.
Ah.
But sometime in seventh grade, I was like, this is what I want to do. And there was this nebulous idea of wanting to be the next Tolkien and Roddenberry and Spielberg combined. Big dreams for a seventh grader. but yeah, it was just like the other factor of this was that I could see the impact that stories had on society and on
Mm.
perspectives and how people viewed other people. And I was like, oh, if I can tell my story, then the hardships that I'm experiencing because of who I am, I can address those and maybe help change culture to be better for people like me.
Wow. So it was really like this growing understanding of meaning making through story, your
Yes.
own and people in general, and the power of that. And oh boy,
Mm.
if you could be all of those people combined, but you should be you, right? What great ambition. Really, really interesting. The other thing, I love this epiphany. I'm glad that we gave the opportunity to have an epiphany about that storytelling was a place that, at least initially, was not a place with that inner voice, the judgment, the rules, the you've got to do it a certain way in order to be successful, is more freeing. And there was more sort of agency for you to just let it out there. I think that's really powerful, actually. I don't know if there's more you want to say about that, but I was really struck by that.
Yeah, I was struck by that too this morning. I got to spend some more time meditating on it because yeah, I my family background is complex. I had this duality of being in a home where there was a lot of expression of love and support, but it was also undermined in a lot of ways. And uh, yeah, there's not enough time to go into all of that, but there was just a lot of pressure all the time and pressure to perform. And I know my parents themselves felt pressure to perform, and so that got shared on me.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, being able to just go into my bedroom and or like on a car trip or wherever, I've got my notebook and I'm writing my version of the Lord of the Rings, you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
And in those stories, were you the protagonist?
There was definitely a lot of transference of my personality, but then there was also elements that were absolutely not. So sometimes things that like, oh, I wish I could be this, or this is a cool personality trait. And I think writers do that all the time. Anyway, there's always some element of us in all of our characters.
Of course.
But one thing, so I didn't realize that I was disabled, specifically that term, until the last few years.
Really?
Yes. And I've been disabled my whole life.
You're actually segueing into my next question, which let's go here.
Okay. Yeah, so I had the cultural ableism is the broadest term for that, of just like, oh, disability is you can't do things. And yes, that is actually true. Disability means I have a lack of ability in certain ways, or and that ability can be from me where I'm not able to, like, I get dizzy because I have Meniere's disease. So like people do the baseball bat thing where they spin around in a circle and it's like I can't like, there's certain things that I can't do physically or emotionally or whatever, but then there's also the societal things where I can't do something because society is built a certain way. So
Right.
both of those things are operating. But yeah, I never identified with the word disability simply because I had the wrong definition of what it was in my mind. So, yeah, looking back, it was a few years ago, and I had been on this journey of like awareness of what the term disability meant and how it was applied, and a lot of dismantling of my own internalized ableism.
Sure.
And I was looking back and thinking back of all the writing that I've done all the way back to 7th grade, and I went, oh my gosh, all of my main characters have had a disability, and I didn't even realize it.
My mind is blown.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah, you have these epiphanies where you learn something about yourself and you go, "Oh, why didn't I see that?" And then you take that with now this new information. It's like, "Oh, I can be intentional about this now."
Wow. Very cool. So we skirted around my next question. I'm going to go straight down the middle.
Go
So
for
the
it.
question is for you to tell us about your experiences as a person with a disability. So we've heard a little bit about that, but I think our audience would like to understand, okay, so it took until a few years ago for you to identify that way, but you've had experiences your whole life, and
Yes.
maybe before and since there are differences, but I'm just curious about that for you.
Yeah, and there are so many stories and like I have a lot of different disabilities. Like Meniere's disease is one that I don't often talk about because usually that's one that doesn't impact me as much as many of the other ones.
On a day to
Um,
day.
on a
Sure.
day to day, when I'm having a symptom flare, absolutely.
Right.
So yeah, one of the big ones is so I'm autistic and ADHD, and I wasn't diagnosed as autistic until I was 40. So coming up on 2 years ago,
Wow.
right? And I
So
didn't
I can
know
only
I was
imagine. I mean, I hear these stories all the time of people
right.
who are diagnosed later, like what that does to your understanding of who you are.
Yeah. And at first, it was a huge jaw drop moment because my picture of what autism, the diagnosis was, didn't line up with me.
Yep.
And the funny thing was I was researching a character. And so I found this amazing resource called Embrace Autism. There's a website and they have all of the self-assessment quizzes, and these quizzes are medically, there's studies showing their efficacy. Is that the correct term?
That is the
Um,
correct
okay.
phrase or word.
And they do a great breakdown of like these are the weaknesses of this test and this is the weakness of this test, so like really great information. Found it researching this character, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to take the tests as myself first as like a baseline, and then I'm going to take the tests as the character and like use that to develop the character. So I took
Fascinating.
the first test as myself, and it came back saying, "You're probably autistic." Like,
Wow.
you scored really high.
And this was
Um,
completely surprising to you.
yeah, well, yeah, mostly. And even before this, I follow a lot of autistic social media advocates or creators. I have a lot of friends who are autistic, which should have been my first clue. It's like, wow, we get along great. I understand you better than other people.
Mhm.
Mm, yeah. So there were some hints in there, but it was also like oh, oh, oh. And so there were these big light bulb moments. And in going through the quiz, just reading the questions that were being asked, I'm like, oh, this is autism. And a lot of the traits have so much overlap with my other conditions, whatever you want to call them. Like, I'm diagnosed with CPTSD. And so there's a huge overlap with trauma responses
Yep.
and autism and ADHD. And from my 30s onwards, I was doing a lot of searching for like what are all the different symptoms, cuz I've also been diagnosed with fibromyalgia. I'm probably like POTS, I'm MCAS, So there's a lot of physical stuff too, and these are all conditions that are very common in autistic folks. And didn't know that at the time. And so yeah, I'm trying to figure out why I'm struggling so much, and mostly especially in the beginning of the 30s, my 30s and onwards, I'm like, why am I in so much pain all the time? So and there was a period of 3 years where I was bedridden 80% of the time.
Oh my goodness.
A healthcare practitioner said with the rate of decline that I was at that time, I probably only had 15 years left.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so since then, I've found a treatment that is helping, and it's a multimodal treatment that, like, there's not many places that really do this. So I can't go like, hey, go and do this. But it's like retraining the nervous system and bringing the nervous system back in balance and back into the parasympathetics, because I was just in constant fight or flight. And if you're in fight or flight and your parasympathetics are the healing part of the body, if that is never active, well, then you're in pain and can't
Yeah.
function. So yeah, I was constantly searching for more and more and more answers, constantly being frustrated by the medical industry, being told different things by different doctors, being gaslit, and so a lot of online research, and that can be dangerous, but it's really the only option for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I'd find more and more answers. I'd talk to more people, and I'd one epiphany of like, oh, that sounds like me. And I dig a little further. I'd usually eventually get diagnosed with a medical practitioner. Sometimes not. We'd find something else. And then that would be connected to something else. So I'd start researching that. Like, oh, this is, and I'd follow that rabbit trail. So very ADHD, very autistic. And then with the growing community on social media, on all the different platforms of
Yes.
disabled people in all the different, autistic, ADHD, CPTSD, fibromyalgia, all the different ones, talking about our stories, more and more people are realizing, oh, that's me too, and getting a proper diagnosis, or choosing to just self-diagnose and avoiding all the medical trauma, because getting diagnosed with a lot of these things doesn't really get you anything. Like,
Yep.
there's no services. So yeah. um and then yeah, I'm continuing on that journey of learning more about the diagnoses, and as I get those diagnoses, I'm like, oh, I didn't realize I was gaslighting myself so
Say
much.
more about that.
So there's a whole level of validity. So the first part can be pretty pretty challenging, because it goes like, hey, here's your ableism, or at the best, here's the misinformation that you've been taught. And so the autism was like a big, oh gosh, does that mean I'm like this bad? Is my picture of how I conduct myself? And then I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so ableist, you know?
You're having this dialogue with yourself.
Right.
Wow.
And so that actually has informed how I approach my content on social media, where I typically write scripts where I play two different characters
Yep,
with
I've seen
two
them.
different perspectives. And it's my own inner experiences of like, oh my gosh, this is what I was thinking. Is this what it? And then I like have this conversation with myself. So yeah, you have to be willing to be uncomfortable with your ableism and with the diagnoses. And in a lot of ways, it's very freeing, because like I get into a social situation and I go, oh, I'm masking right now. Do I want to continue masking right now, or do I want to drop that mask?
So you're doing this like meta level,
Yeah.
and you're taking agency,
Yes.
again, to use that word, right?
Yeah.
I notice that I'm doing this thing, in this case masking. I can choose whether to do that or to do something else.
Sometimes. If the trauma response is overly active, then sometimes I can't pull that mask down. But if the trauma response is overly active, then that probably means that I need to have the mask up in that situation. Sometimes when I'm doing speaking engagements or podcasts or those kinds of things, whatever is happening in the rest of my life already has me activated. And so just the stress of it can make me mask a little more, or it can make me have more symptoms. Today, I'm doing pretty good. I'm pretty eloquent. My words are coming to my mouth. But sometimes I get on and I'm just like, I can't think of words at all. I'm stumbling. And
What do you
yeah,
do in those situations?
it depends on the situation. If it's like a podcast like this, uh, sometimes you or a speaking engagement,
Yeah.
you don't have to. People can make the choice to stop, but I do the best I can, and I usually soldier on. I have a background in public speaking. My dad has a doctorate in interpersonal communication and teaches, or well, taught public speaking. Starting in middle school, I would travel around with him doing public speaking. So I have a lot of training and background in that, where I have muscle memory that I can default to the skills. And then, sometimes when I'm doing a speaking engagement and I'm struggling, or I'm doing a podcast, whatever it is, I say, hey, this is a part of my disability. So, and I use it as a teaching lesson. The nice thing is, when I'm filming with my social media stuff, I can do as many takes as I want. So yeah.
Very interesting. I love this idea of your internal conversations, and I've seen how you externalize them in your social media work, which is great, great stuff.
Thank you.
So you alluded to this earlier, but I want to know more. Our listeners are going to want to know more about the arts education that you received. So you said you grew up doing a lot of music and other things, and your parents had that in their backgrounds as well. I'm curious about the formal training that you've had, and even the sort of informal training, like you were just talking about with public speaking with your dad.
Gotcha. Musically, I started playing violin at 3 years old using the Suzuki method. And it was pretty intense for an autistic kid. And I did that for a number of years, but my sister was 2 years older, so she had a 2 year jump start on me, and I could never compare. I had a lot of rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which I didn't realize that's what it was at the time. Um, and I was also very sick as a kid, where
Mm.
my sister has like an immune system of, I don't know a good analogy, but she rarely gets sick. And I had digestive issues, so I have irritable bowel syndrome. I had cyclical vomiting. I had all these things. And so my mom taught piano, and one of the things that she did was like 100 practice days in a row, and you got a big celebration. And I could never do it because I always got sick. So there were things like that. But I switched to piano sometime in elementary school, did that for a number of years, and then in sixth grade I switched to trumpet when band started. So I was doing trumpet, piano, soccer, baseball all at the same time.
Wow.
That got too much, so I dropped piano. And then, I was always in like the school plays starting in elementary school. And yeah, there's like so many different things with my experiences with this. But yeah, and like after school, my parents, quote unquote, were investing in my sister and I, but there was just like always stuff that we were doing. And with my dad's connections and my mom's connections to like universities and music programs and stuff,
Yeah.
We did after school art. We did after school music. I was at the university doing music theory while my dad's in class doing his doctorate, you know. So like I'm getting these advanced trainings
Yeah.
in elementary and middle school, which in some ways was amazing, but in other ways was a lot and too much and a lot of pressure. So like I'm very grateful for all of that background because like I'm using my music background in my writing. You know, it helps me with my pacing. The music education informs so much of everything that I do creatively.
Say
Uh,
more about that. So I can imagine things like the rhythm of language and, as you said,
yes.
pacing, but I'm curious how your music education informs what you're doing now.
Yeah. There's so much to rhythm and even pitch, and a lot of it I've ingrained subconsciously, which I think is where you want to get to. That's like where you start to get mastery. I didn't master it in music, but at least in terms of an instrument. But
You
like,
didn't, maybe it was that you didn't master it externally, but you mastered it internally.
yeah, I always struggled a bit with instruments for various different reasons, but I sing. So I'm in musical theory, or not musical theory, musicals in theater today. Not today, but I do
These
musicals.
days.
uh, and so yeah, like it's hard to explain that there's rhythm to everything that I write. There's when I'm recording myself for the stuff, I'm paying attention to the pitch and the pacing and all of this. So it's like it all reads as music in my mind. Even
You're
the
composing. You're
yeah,
composing and you're arranging.
right. Um and I'm not consciously thinking I'm doing that. It just all kind of interconnects.
That makes sense.
Um so yeah, and it ties in with dance. I didn't do a whole lot of like specific dance instruction, but I was in show choir and those kinds of things as well. So yeah, and filmmaking is such a beautiful art because you pull in every single, it's visual
Yes.
art, it's audio art, it's music art, it's dance art and movement art, all of these different modalities. And then like my interest in sciences comes in as well. So I'm just borrowing from all of my special interests. I do woodworking, and so I make props, and just everything funnels in
I love
to my
that. You're like
creative.
chief cook and bottle washer for all of it. I
Yes,
love
yeah,
that. Fantastic. So I know from having reviewed your website and gotten familiar with your work that you also do consulting. Can you
yes,
talk a little bit about the consulting that you do?
yeah. I kind of fell into that because um, there's so much ableism in the film industry. I graduated college in 2004 and I started freelancing. And I got to be pretty quickly at the top of the local first called freelancers list. So I learned how to run a jib, which is it's, I was on a 20-foot boom arm. So the thing weighs 1,000 pounds. You got 500 pounds of weights on the back. You got the camera 20 feet away, and you're swinging this thing around to get shots. So I worked on the ABC Miracle Worker, uh, did those kinds of things. Um, and doing that kind of freelance work was great until my disabilities interfered.
Ah,
So I was having a lot of digestive disabilities. And I was shooting a bunch of different things. So some of them were live shows where I was camera op. But if you're doing a live show and you have to run to the bathroom as a camera operator, that becomes challenging. And so, and at the time I was still having cyclical vomiting, which I didn't realize that's what it was. So after a few shoots of vomiting, and having to run to the bathroom, I got removed from all the call lists. And there weren't accommodations made. And I didn't know that it was a disability or that I could ask for them,
Right.
but they like I did talk to them when they're like, "Hey, you're not reliable." I'm like, "But this is medical stuff. Why can't there?" And they're just like, "Yeah, sorry." And I had so many experiences like that in many different ways beyond just freelancing. And so in 2009, I kind of fell into social media because I could make my own hours. I became I had success in social media. I so the in 2009 I met this guy named Chris Downing. At the time, he was teaching 2 exercise classes at night during the week. And he's like, "Yeah, I want to do personal training to supplement my acting work." He's like, "You want to help me make a YouTube channel?" I'm like, "Sure." And within a couple of years, he owned half the gym. The year later, he owned the gym outright. He started training NFL, NBA, professional athletes.
Cool.
And then a few years after that, he got picked up by Beachbody, and he's one of the highest selling Beachbody. He's no longer with Beachbody, but he was one of the highest selling Beachbody super trainers. And so, like, that launched my social media career because we had all of these videos that were getting a lot of views. So I started actually in social media consulting to like how to do that. And then as I did that, disability just kept coming up.
Yeah.
My own disability, and then sometimes with uh, people within the organization or whoever I was working with. And so I realized, like, I've always been talking about disability. I just didn't know that that's what I was doing. Um, so in 2021, I think I was like, I've been doing social media for other people my whole career. I'm going to do it for myself because I think I could probably, you know, apply some of the things that I teach. um, but mostly I was doing it for myself as self expression. And like, I deliberately broke a lot of my rules for, for what I do because I'm like, it wasn't accessible for me. It's like posting on a regular schedule can be important, and I just couldn't do it because my disabilities and my time. I didn't. Yeah, so I'm like, okay, when I have the energy and availability, I'll shoot something and then I'll put it up when I can. And it was basically like this was my own form of therapy for myself to get things off my chest and to put things out there that I didn't see other people were talking about. And
Right.
maybe they were just not in my feed. So I made my first video and it got 15,000 views. I go, huh, okay. So I made my second video and it got 12,000 views. I'm like, hmm, maybe there's a bigger audience for this than I thought.
Yeah.
I put my third video out and it got 15,000 views. And I'm like, well, I guess I'm doing this. Um, so yeah, that started my social media advocacy work. And then I started promoting myself less for social media work and more for disability advocate or disability representation consulting, and just slowly transitioned into that so that now I'm not really taking on clients for social media work. Sometimes those dovetail where I'm hired as a disability consultant and I'm like, hey, we got to talk about your social media strategy. So, I work that in. But yeah, so I started doing social media, or excuse me, disability representation consulting, applying my own lived experiences and the just vast amount of research that I had done, and am always in continuing learning and doing more into disability and disability advocacy.
Wow. Um, I feel like in this conversation, there's been this theme, this since we started talking, that I'm just going to say out loud, which is one of these. I hadn't realized that I'd been doing this all along, or
Yeah,
I hadn't realized that I was this all along, or I was
right.
dealing with. It feels like a lot of your journey has been made conscious to you later or
Yep.
like midway,
Yeah.
rather than I'm going to set out and do X, or this is how I identify and I'm going to forge my road, which I
Yeah.
think is really interesting and very important for other people to hear.
Yeah. And I'm hoping that the doors that I've been able to open, because it really has been me opening the door. I've not had too many doors open to me other than like individual opportunity. But career path doors has been, well, nobody will employ me. I'll employ myself.
Yeah.
And then yeah, I do that for a while and go, oh right, this is a thing. This is what I've been doing. Um, and so yeah, when somebody's thinking about having me on as a speaker or podcast host, well, with my following today, I'm not as much asked these questions, but earlier on, they're like, "Well, how long have you been doing this?" I'm like, "Well, public speaking or public speaking about disability specifically? Because public speaking I've been doing since I don't know, elementary school, really, but with a focus starting in middle school." And that public speaking was dealt with leadership and it dealt with communication. And it's like, oh, all that dovetails into disability. It was just framed in a ministry setting because my dad was in the ministry.
Sure.
So yeah, it's a series of realizations and epiphanies of like, oh yeah, I have a ton of experience. I've been doing this all along. I can just now focus that.
Mhm.
So I was leading somewhere and now I remember where I was going.
Oh, good.
um, the drive that I've had ever since seventh grade has been I want to be a writer director in Hollywood.
Ah,
Those doors have been closed. I've been knocking on those doors, I've been battering around those doors, and the doors on the level at which I want to be haven't been opening. And so I'm still in the entertainment industry because social media is still entertainment,
you bet.
and I'm hoping to use that to then eventually do these things. So I'm under NDA, but I'm doing um, consulting work for studios, production companies, that kind of thing that
Great.
hopefully can lead. They're going to lead to those things.
Let's manifest it. Absolutely.
Yes. And then at the same time, I'm working on my own projects because, like, hey, if you're not going to open your door, I'm going to go do it myself and then prove that I can be successful so that they go, oh, we should have hired you from the beginning.
Perfect. Love that. We have two more questions for you. And
All right.
you gave me the segue to one of them, which is aside from the things you can't describe, can you tell us about something you're currently working on?
In terms of consulting or in terms of my own creative work?
Pick one.
Okay, I'll talk about my own creative work. I'm always working on a number of different things, and it's one of the accommodations that I have for myself, where um, I don't. So a lot of the advice out there is like focus on one thing, do it until you're done with it. Don't get distracted, which can be good in proper moderation, but also with my uh, neuro reality, sometimes I need to step away. Sometimes I'm getting in my own way and I jump to another project and I come back.
Yeah, I mean, the
So,
way you've described your brain, I would think your brain is not wired to stay on one thing.
yeah. And then sometimes I'll hyper focus and I'll until I'm burnt out on that thing and I'll go work on something else, take that a little closer to the finish line and then hop back. And so people think like, oh, well, you're not getting anything done until like, a few years pass. And I'm like, oh, I have 7 projects that I've completed. I've just been working on them in tandem. So one of the projects that I'm really thrilled about that I'm working on now, I've already written the television pilot for it, but I'm also writing it as a novel. And it's called Scrapped Hope. And the idea is it's a world of islands separated by caustic ocean where air superiority determines like prosperity or destitution. And my main character is a wheelchair using pilot, and she's desperate to escape her life of impoverished servitude. So she enters her home built scrap metal airplane as a competitor in the International Air Games.
Wow.
Yeah. And so when she enters, she wants to be a racer, but the racing category is already filled up. And so she has to join into the combat melee. And so combat is paintball with airplanes.
Okay.
So, nobody's dying. It's just like, yeah. And she gets recruited by a team of all disabled pilots and support members and all that kind of thing. And so they're kind of the team of misfits who have to compete in this very ableist society. So
I love the sound of that. And that definitely sounds like Tolkien and Spielberg and all the rest in
well,
your
in
unique
7th
way.
grade, I hadn't been introduced to my favorite yet, which is Hayao Miyazaki.
Ah, now I see the influence.
Yes.
Very cool. Oh, that's very cool. Jeremy, last question for you. What advice would you give to someone with a disability who's a creative?
This is a question that I'm always very careful about because there is so much bad advice out there, specifically when applied to people with disabilities. And then there's also a lot of good advice out there, which is bad advice for certain people or not the right advice at the right time. And our industry is filled with advice, a lot of it conflicting. And so my advice is to not take my advice. Which, if you do take my advice to not take my advice, then you've taken my advice, which works for me. But if you don't take my advice in taking my advice, then you've taken my advice, which is good for me. But yeah, so my advice is to be careful of the amount of weight that you put on the advice that you hear. And put yourself first and really listen to yourself when you hear advice to go, is this the right advice for me? And I mentioned this earlier with I need to jump from project to project sometimes, but sometimes I need to focus on a project and push myself a little further. And there's so many different ways that advice can be applied to provide yourself accommodation. Like one of the ones that you hear all the time for writers is write every day. That does not work for me. Right. It does not work for me. If I do that, number one, I'll burn myself out. Number two, my health doesn't allow me to. So right. I have to be constantly dynamic with, I've not been able to write for a few weeks. I need to find my inspiration again, be intentional, but pick it up and not guilt trip and shame myself for not writing for those 3 weeks. So that's my advice.
I like it. I really do. And what a terrific conversation. I could sit and chat with you for hours, but I really appreciate the time that you've spent today. So thank you for taking this time to speak with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. We are looking forward to your guest hosting and the folks that you'll be interviewing in the upcoming episodes.
Yes, it's going to be good.
It's going to be great. Thank you. Able Voices is a production of the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education, led by me, Dr. Rhoda Bernard, the founding managing director. It is produced by Daniel Martinez del Campo. The intro music is by Kai Levin, and our closing song is by Sebastian Batista. Kai and Sebastian are students in the arts education programs at the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education. If you would like to learn more about our work, find us online at berkeley.edu/BIAAE or email us at BIAAE@berkeley, that's LEE.edu.